I could not be more fired up that my first guest is somebody who I consider a terrific friend and a legend in the business of calling sporting events and a voice of generations. And I say that fully aware that, again, that allows me to pick up dinner the next time. Here on Just Getting Started is none other than the voice of Sunday Night Football, Al Michaels. How are you, sir?
I'm fantastic, Rich. Thank you very much. And I'll leave the tip. You can pick up the rest of the tab.
I am genuinely excited about this conversation, Al, because the number of times I've had talks with you about how you got started in your career and the stories that you tell, not only just around a dinner table, but in your fantastic memoir. You just can't make this up. Did I get that right? Did I screw up one of the names? And it's
close enough.
It's I love your stories. So I'll just get right into it, Al, with you. How did you just get started in your career? How did it all start?
I have to go all the way back to growing up in Brooklyn. I grew up 10 blocks from Ebbets Field when the Dodgers were still playing in Brooklyn. And my father walked me over to Ebbets Field one Saturday afternoon when I was probably 6 or 7. It's the first thing I remember in life. I remember walking in and, the grass was so green, and Vince Scully always talked about the Dodger uniforms being wedding cake white, signage on the outfield walls. The organ is playing, the whole thing. Jackie Robinson is actually in that game. Duke Snider, Gil Hodges, and a lot of the great Dodgers of the past. And I remember thinking, I want to be here every day. This is the greatest thing in the world. So my father was a big sports fan. We lived within walking distance of Ebbets Field. And so I grew up with the Brooklyn Dodgers, knowing I wanted to be in the ballpark every day. And then as I got a little older, realized I could get in for free by getting a job as maybe the broadcaster for the Dodgers or some team down the line. So that was the genesis of my love for baseball, my love for sports. My father took me to hockey at Madison Square Garden, the old Garden, to the football Giants playing at Yankee Stadium. Also, remember the New York baseball Giants and Yankees were playing there. So we had 3 teams in New York. So we could take the subway to the Polo Grounds, Yankee Stadium. So that's how I grew up. And the NBA, when it only had 8 teams at Madison Square Garden, so you'd have a doubleheader and 4 teams would come in on a Saturday afternoon. So I knew, Rich, exactly what I wanted to do from the time I was probably 7 years old.
And how did you go about it? About getting your start, about making this dream of talking sports, broadcasting sports. How did you make that happen?
When it came time to pick a college, I went to high school. We'd moved to Los Angeles, ironically, the same year that the Dodgers did. So I never missed a beat. So the Dodgers at the Coliseum. But it's now time for me to go to college. And my father and I looked at colleges at that point that had radio stations and or TV stations that allowed students to broadcast games. There were very, very few of them. I liked living out west. I didn't want to go back east. USC was one of the schools, and Arizona State was another of the schools that we researched. And SC was in town. I wanted to have the experience of going away to college, so I chose Arizona State. And we made a trip down there when I was a high school senior. We talked to the people at ASU, and they said, at some point as a student, I'll get to announce some games on the campus radio station, which, of course, had a radius of like 4 blocks, unless you were in the women's the boiler room at the dorm. You couldn't pick the thing up. But it gave me a lot of experience. I go down to school, and I wind up doing 4 years of baseball, basketball, football. I'm the sports editor of the campus newspaper. And one of the great stories for me, Rich, was that as a freshman in 1962, I go down there, long registration line, probably 45 minutes before we can get to the place where we need to start filling out the forms. And I started a conversation with the kid in front of me, who was a freshman from the Cleveland area, and he was there on a baseball scholarship. And I tell him what I want to do, and I hope to have the opportunity to broadcast some of his games. His dream, of course, is to play baseball, see where that goes. 10 years later, I'm announcing for the Cincinnati Reds. He's the third baseman for the Oakland A's. We're both a part of the World Series. Sal Bando. Oh, yeah. So Sal and I had that conversation in a registration line. And then I would go on to eventually get the Reds job when I was 27 years old. And Sal plays third base for the soon to be three-time champion Oakland A's, who beat the Reds in the World Series in 72 and won it again in 70, 73 and 74. So Sal and I go back all the way. The following year, a guy named Rick Monday comes to school. And Rick had a pretty good career and still broadcast the Dodger games. And then when I'm a junior, a freshman comes along by the name of Reginald Martinez Jackson, the one and only Reggie Jackson. So we went all the way back. The coach was Bobby Winkles, who would wind up managing in the majors with Oakland and California and coaching for several teams. So that's where I really cut my eye teeth in broadcasting.
Well, I mean, and I got to have you tell this story. By the way, I did not know about that story, but you have to tell the story about how you called minor league games in Hawaii that I guess eventually did lead to the job that you just referenced in Cincinnati, I assume.
That's exactly what happened. So when I get out of college and I get married, I met a girl in the 10th grade, and you know her very well, Linda Michaels. You know, she's still in the next room right now. So that worked out pretty well. And then I was looking for a job. So I wrote to all of the minor league teams, major league teams, NBA teams. In fact, the Phoenix Suns were starting up, and I had just graduated. And I wind up trying to get the Phoenix Suns job. He said, I just wanted to get into broadcasting. And the guy who's going to run that team is a guy named Jerry Colangelo, who was like 27 or 28 years old. I'm in his office, which is in a trailer at the Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Phoenix before the Phoenix Suns ever play a game. And Jerry couldn't have been greater. I mean, you go all the way back, and I feel like, Forrest Gump from time to time. But anyway, so I wrote to all of the teams. My father-in-law happened to have a business in Hawaii. And I'm getting, responses, we wish you well, blah, 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 but there's no job that's forthcoming. And he says to me, hey, come with me to Hawaii, or meet me in Hawaii. Come over, for 3 or 4 days. I know some people over here. There's a minor league team. So I reluctantly did. I wanted to do everything on my own, but I went over there, and he introduced me to an advertising executive who introduced me to a man by the name of Jack Quinn, who was the general manager of the Hawaii Islanders baseball team, AAA Pacific Coast League. And I got an audience with Jack Quinn. I gave him a reel-to-reel tape from Arizona State. This is in February of '68. And he says, good luck. We'll stay in touch. Thinking, he won't stay in touch. But on the cusp of the season in '68, his primary announcer, a guy named Marty Chase, was in a reserve unit that had been called to active duty. So I get a call on the eve of the season from Jack Quinn, who said, can you come over here and announce a few games? And that led to doing 3 years of the Hawaii Islanders, University of Hawaii football and basketball. High school football and basketball is gigantic. It was on television twice a day on the ABC affiliate there. I got 15, 20 years experience in 3 years. Because in football, I would do 5 games a weekend, 4 high school games and a college game. Anyway, the Hawaii Islanders, we were the California Angels Farm Club, 68, 69, and 70. And what happened was we wound up drawing about 500,000 people. We were the most successful minor league team. Our manager, Chuck Tanner, winds up getting the White Sox job beginning in '71. The farm director for the Angels, Roland Heeman, winds up going to Chicago, the longtime general manager. Those guys actually tried to get me to Chicago to be the announcer there. So they went to Chicago. It's now after their season in 1970. And the owner of the team is a guy named John Allen, Allyn. Listen to the tape. I've got Tanner and Heeman trying to get me to Chicago. There's an opening there. He tells them, look, this kid sounds pretty good. I can't bring a 25, 26-year-old kid into Chicago and make him the number one announcer in the number 2 market, which Chicago was at that time. So I'm very, very disappointed. But then about a week and a half later, out of nowhere, comes a call from the Cincinnati Reds from a man by the name of Dick Wagner, the number 2 guy to Bob Housem in the structure there. Can you come to Cincinnati? We want to talk to you. They'd heard about me. Somebody had sent them an audition tape. I go to Cincinnati. I get the job. And here I am at the age of 26 years old. I'm the announcer for the Big Red Machine with Pete Rose in his prime, Johnny Bench coming into his prime, Tony Perez in his prime, Davey Concepcion, the older Ken Griffey would get there in 73, and Joe Morgan getting traded over in 72. And that's how I wind up on the World Series in 72, because in those years, Rich, NBC would use the primary announcer for the teams that are in the series. The home team guy would do his games in Cincinnati. I did the games in Cincinnati. In Oakland, I did NBC radio. And that's how I wound up doing the World Series. And that's how I wound up doing the series and announcing my college friend Sal Bando playing third base for the A's.
Unbelievable. I do have to, before we move on to the NFL, I got to linger here. Your best Sparky Anderson story. I mean, what was it like being around him, managing the Big Red Machine? Rose, give me your go-to. Give me one of your favorites being around this Reds team.
The greatest thing for me in Cincinnati is that I had to do a show with Sparky every day for 10 minutes. They called it the main Spark. So Sparky, he could have been greater. And Sparky was only about maybe 37, 38 years old at the time, and he looked like he was 100. Sparky always was withered with the white hair. I got my PhD from Sparky because not only did we have to do this show, we did 600 of these shows because we did every spring training game, every regular season game, all 162, and then we were in postseason 2 of the 3 years. So I truly did about 600 shows with Sparky. So you had 10 minutes, so we had to be alone, and then he would oftentimes close the door. We would tape the show, and then we'd sit there and talk for another 20 minutes, off mic. So I learned so much from Sparky. And Pete Rose, I always made it a point, we were on the road, on the bus, I would try to sit next to Pete because he could go through the entire game pitch by pitch, telling me exactly what he thought, exactly what he was thinking. You had him, you had Johnny, who knew everything. Morgan comes over. I mean, man, oh man, I'm going to Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, and Yale all at the same time.
It's just amazing. And then you got to tell quickly, or however you wish, the story about you getting a recommendation to the Dodgers organization through your calling games in Hawaii, and who was the one who did it and how. I love this. Is maybe one of my favorite stories I've ever heard you tell. Al, please tell it. Go for it.
Well, and of course it involves the great Tommy LaSorda. So in Hawaii, our big rival in 1968, 69, and 70 was the Spokane Indians. The Indians were the Dodgers AAA farm club. So, and those were the Spokane Indians that had Bobby Valentine, Bill Buckner, Steve Garvey, Bill Russell, Davey Lopes. These were the Dodgers of the 70s playing in Spokane. Because of travel and how expensive it was, when a team would come to Hawaii, they'd be there all week. You'd play 7 games. So I got to know the Spokane Indians because they'd come over twice for 2 7-game series. So the manager is Tommy LaSorda. And LaSorda used to love to tell this story. He embellished it a little bit, but most of it is true. So he would get on the phone after every game, and Al Campanis was the Dodger general manager, and he'd report back. He'd go, Al, here's what Valentine did tonight, and Garvey went 2 for 4, and Russell did this. Here's how the pitchers did. So it's, I think, the 6th game of a 7-game series, and toward the end of the conversation, he says, hey, Al, to Campanis, I know you've got Vinny, and Scully's great, and he's going to be there a long time. There's this kid over here in Hawaii. This guy's announcing the games. This guy's really good. This kid, Al Michaels, I'll tell you what, just keep an eye on him. So they continue the conversation, and then at the end of the conversation, Campanis says to LaSorda, this Michaels kid, this guy you're talking about, how do you know he's any good? Tommy says, I've been thrown out of the last 4 games. I've been sitting down in the clubhouse listening to him. So what really happened was LaSorda gets thrown out in the 3rd inning of like the third game of the series. Now, in the fourth game of the series, he's so mad from the night before, he gets thrown out with the lineup card. Now, in Hawaii, you don't go behind the dugout to the clubhouse. The clubhouse is 100 feet beyond the center field fence. It's a 500-foot walk, and you're being serenaded. So he's long gone. He can't sneak back in. He truly is in the clubhouse listening. He's the fifth game. I think he stays in the game the whole way. The sixth game, he gets thrown out in about the fourth inning. So he's thrown out of 3 out of 4. Now, you talk about you can't believe where you are. The umpire who threw him out of those games was Bruce Fremming, who would go on to umpire 37 consecutive years in the National League. So we go all the way back. And whenever I got an award, I would have to bring LaSorda in to tell the story. Tommy was one of a kind.
I love it. He's thrown out with the lineup card, so he gets to actually hear you call the action. So you actually know he knew it. Oh God, I love that story. So how did you get to football? How did that come around to you finally getting to the sport, which is amazing? Obviously, your baseball career got you into national broadcasting, and then obviously you called so many games on the national level, including the famous earthquake game, but also the Miracle on Ice is something that is with you forever, but you are legitimately the voice of the NFL and have been for a very long time. How did you get to that chair?
Well, in Hawaii, again, I go back to doing 5 games a weekend, 4 high school and a college game for 3 years. So by the time I left Hawaii, I had probably called 150 football games. And I called all the football games when I was a student at Arizona State. So I had truly called like 200 football games. By the time I get to the Cincinnati Reds, who let me, when the season was over, do a couple of regional games, football games for NBC. So I actually did, in October of 71, on a point-to-point telecast, I did Buffalo at Minnesota. And 2 weeks later, because Kurt Gowdy was tied up with baseball, I did Buffalo at the Jets. So my first 2 NFL games were in 1971, going just to the home market, or actually the road market, because it was blacked out in the home cities at that point. So I do that, and then my first partner was Johnny Morris, the wide receiver for the Bears, who still owns a lot of those records. If you hear me talking about Johnny when we do a Bears game, it's because Johnny and I go all the way back. And then a guy named Dave Kasurik did the second game with me. But what happened was when I leave Cincinnati after 3 years, one of the reasons I left, the primary reason, is I go to San Francisco, they tripled my salary. So that's number one. But number two, the Giants were willing to let me miss games during the football season at the end to do football games on a regional basis. So in 74, I did about 8 or 9 regional games for NBC. And then we couldn't make a deal for 75. We're talking about in those years, like the difference between like $750 and $1,000 a game, as ridiculous as that sounds. And I went to CBS for a year. And that led to, in 76, when ABC started Monday Night Baseball, they called me, and I wound up doing the B game, which led to me being at ABC full-time for 30 years. And I eventually wound up doing the number 2 game on college football behind Keith Jackson in the late 70s and early 80s. And that led to the NFL in 86. It was a long roundabout way that I got there, doing some regional NFL games in the early 70s, a lot of college games between 77 and 85, and then to Monday Night Football for 20 years, beginning in 86.
So a few strands to pull on here. So does that mean there is a CBS Sports Blazer in your past, Al? Did you ever get one of those for your 1 year at CBS?
I'm not sure I got one, and I certainly would not have kept it, because Don Cricky and I were the only guys in 1975 who did not get a postseason assignment. And we didn't even get the Sun Bowl. And Don and I talked about that through the years. I mean, everybody else on the staff wound up, getting an assignment. It was, the one thing I do remember about the CBS years, among my partners that year was the late Wayne Walker, Johnny Unitas. I did a game with Johnny Unitas. Johnny Morris was now at CBS. I did a game with him. And then I wound up doing like the last 5 games of that season with Hank Stram, and we had a blast. We loved it. And then Hank had been fired by the Chiefs. He goes to CBS. We do, they were moving partners around left and right. So I had Hank for like 4 or 5 games at the end of the season. And then Hank goes back to coaching the Saints. A wonderful man. I loved Hank. And there's nobody who could tan more easily than Hank Stram, who used to be sitting out by the pool with bear grease on and one of those tinfoil reflectors. But he was a beauty. I loved old Henry.
What was it like doing a game with Unitas? Was he good at it?
He was okay. First of all, I mean, wow, I couldn't believe I'm doing a game with Johnny Unitas. Are you kidding me? But he was fine to work with, but he was, he didn't have a lot of experience. I'm not sure Johnny did more than 1 or 2 seasons of some regional games with him. But the interesting thing, the one game I did with Unitas in the 75 season was New Orleans at Oakland. And I was living in the Bay Area at the time because I was doing the Giants. And I drove over to go to the Raiders practice in Alameda during the middle of the week. And that's the first time I met John Madden. And I sat in John Madden's office in 1975, and he was a big baseball fan. So we talked a lot about baseball. He listened to the Giants, knew my work. And then we talked about everything. We talked about how much we loved Travels with Charlie by Steinbeck. And then John talked about the fact that one day what he wanted to do is, get a camper and just go around the country. So, of course, he coaches the Raiders. He wins the Super Bowl. He has, the best record of any coach in history, percentage-wise, who coached 10 or more seasons. And then he didn't quite get that camper, but of course he got the Madden Cruiser, and that's how John saw the country for 3 decades.
So he was talking about the Madden Cruiser a long time. It was the Madden Camper first before it was the Madden Cruiser.
Camper. That's exactly what it was. And he would be at the wheel. But John and I, that's the first time I met John, and we saw each other irregularly through the years. And then, of course, we became partners between 2002 and 2008, and I had 7 wonderful, wonderful seasons with Coach Madden.
Okay, and so be doing the baseball games with ABC, and obviously you said college football. You meet Keith Jackson. What was he like, Al? Walk me through the voice of college football for all those years after. Obviously, when you first met him, he wasn't that, but he became that.
Everybody forgets this. Certainly, anybody of a certain age is when Monday Night Football started. He was the original play-by-play announcer. So Monday Night Football in 1970 was Keith Jackson, Howard Cosell, and Don Meredith. But Roone Arledge, whose concept this was, always wanted Frank Gifford, one of his great and good buddies in New York. And Gifford couldn't get out of his contract at CBS in 1970, and it wasn't until 71. So Keith gets bounced from Monday Night Football after 1 season. And he was never, after that, a really big fan of Roone Arledge. You can understand why. But Roone attempted to make it up to him by eventually giving Keith the number 1 game in college football, which at that point, I think Chris Schenkel was actually the number 1 announcer before I got there. And by the time I got there, Keith had now ascended to the number 1 role on college football. So Keith and I, because we're doing games on the same day, really never got to cross paths a lot. But Keith had a way with words that was so unique and so different. And I mean, one of the greatest lines I've ever read. Keith had done an interview with a student newspaper at the University of Oregon toward the end of his career, and it's a Q&A. And they talk about, Keith, you've done the Olympics, and you did Monday Night Football, and you've done all the great college football games, and you did baseball and the World Series. Are there any more goals? And Keith's answer was just one. I don't want to die in an airport parking lot. And that was quintessential Keith. The big uglies in the trenches by the banks of the old Uncanny River here in Columbus, Ohio. Keith had a way with words. I mean, it flowed.
That is fantastic, Al. I've never heard that one before. Oh, so, yeah. And then obviously you mentioned his name, and So give me your first meeting with Howard.
So in 1977, now I joined ABC full time. I'm going to do the B game on Monday Night Baseball. I'm going to do some college football at that point, and a lot of wide world of sports shows. So that we were doing a ton of boxing in those years, and they had an event called the United States Boxing Championships. Don King was promoting it, and there was all kinds of chicanery going on behind the scenes, and Congress was about ready to look into this. But Cosell was doing that package until all of a sudden it looks like there's going to be a congressional investigation. So in March of 77, I am ready to leave home on a Friday, and I am going to do the Pro Bowlers Tour, I think in St. Louis, because Chris Schenkel, who did that, was in Kitzbühel, Austria, covering skiing. I get the call at home as I'm on my way to the airport going, go to San Antonio immediately. Why? So, no, because we may have a problem tomorrow, and we need you to help solve this problem for the U.S. Boxing Championships. So I go to San Antonio, and Cosell is already there. But now they're going to take him off the show because they don't want him affiliated with this nefarious concept, right? I mean, the records were being rigged, and King was doing all kinds of stuff behind the scenes. What else is new? So I go into, I'm not even sure I'm going to be on the air the next day. ABC is still deciding whether to take Howard off and put me on as kind of a sacrificial lamb because nobody knew who I was or cared at that point. So I met Howard at dinner, and the crew was out there, producer, director, 2 or 3 other guys, and he couldn't have been nicer. And that was the good Howard. So we had fun, and I think he took a liking to me because he saw in me a guy who, as I like to say, had a little bit of rascal in him, and I was not going to go down the straight and narrow, and I still don't, I think, Rich. I'm careful with where I go, but, I like to have some fun. And I think Howard saw that in me. And so he took a liking to me at first. And then, of course, down the line, we wound up doing a ton of baseball together.
He is one of the reasons why I do what I do. Watching Howard Cosell do Monday Night Football and just hearing him be somebody who wasn't, as you know, he used to rail against the jockocracy, and he wasn't somebody who, that's the name of his book. I know your book is You Can't Make This Up, and his book was I Never Played the Game, or one of them. And I kind of saw, Jewish kid growing up in New York, I saw somebody who wasn't an athlete, didn't play, but get to talk at the highest level and also say things. He had me literally at hello, Howard Cosell.
He took it to the edge. He was the first guy to really take it to the edge. And he was, look, when you do that, you're going to be an extremely polarizing figure. And that's what he was. And I think there was an article in TV Guide maybe in around 1980 where he was the most admired and the most loathed sportscaster of his generation. So you loved him or you hated him. But Howard was of a different ilk, and you're right. There's no question. I think he made it easier for certain people to get in and do certain things that they weren't able to do until that time. Now, of course, we've taken it completely. We've blown the top off everything, where anything goes these days. And Howard wouldn't be a unicorn today, but he was one of the most fascinating human beings I've ever met. He could be everything from charming to cantankerous. I saw all sides of him. He was a lot of fun in the early years, and he wasn't very much fun at the end. He became very bitter toward the end, and it was a very inglorious departure from ABC and from network television. But at that point, Howard he'd grown tired. He really had, and it's too bad that it wound up the way it did. But unfortunately, it was not the departure that everybody wanted to see from him.
And so I guess before we just dive fully in the rest of our interview into the NFL, your best wide world of sports assignment. Give me that one.
Early on, yes. I'm one of my first trips to Europe. I had never been to Europe until I joined ABC, and now they're sending me over there like every other week. It was fantastic. It truly was the wide world, and you got to see it. So I get assigned to an event in Insel, West Germany. At that time, Germany was separated, and in the Bavarian Alps, and it's motorcycles on ice, which was a wide world of sports staple in those years. And so it was a quarter-mile track, which was used for speed skating and for like regular track meets in the summertime. But in the wintertime, it's all iced over. And you have a bunch of Eastern Europeans and Russians at that point, and Bulgarians and Romanians, and it was these are the guys who were competing in this. No Westerners, and they would get on motorcycles, on motorbikes, and go around this quarter-mile track, X number of laps, with a bunch of spikes coming out of the tires. And that's how they got the traction. And they did this in front of 10,000 wild and woolly Bavarians. And they would start it at about 8 o'clock at night. We were taping it in those years. And but the tailgating would be starting at about 3 o'clock. And the schnapps is flowing. I mean, it's just flowing. So it's one of the great stories of all time. So Jeff Mason is the producer, become a great friend, but Jeff has had a fabulous career. He says, why don't we do something different for the scene set? Instead of you coming on in the yellow blazer, blah, 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 welcome to Denzel, West Germany, what if you rode down the straightaway on the bike and then got off the bike, took your helmet off, and welcomed everybody? So I'm the new kid on the block. I'll do anything at that point. But Rich, I had never, a motorcycle, I'd barely been on a Schwinn with training wheels, but I'm saying, oh, fine, that's great. So what they got to put me in some leathers. So they find a Russian. So we go down to where they're staging the bikes, and there's a Russian who's about 5'6" and maybe 145 pounds. And at that point, I'm 5'10", and I probably weigh about 180, and I'm trying to get in to these leathers. So here, I've never been on a bike. Now I'm going to be on a bike on ice with spikes. I'm like this. They put the helmet on my head. That barely fits. I'm squinched up. And now I got to think about it. I'm going to ride down the thing and I'm going to do a scene set on top of it. So having not been on a motorcycle, I don't know how it works. So I'm on the I got the handlebars, and I got everybody there. Like the Russians are talking to me. I got the guy from Czechoslovakia is over here, the Romanians. I got 15 different languages coming at me at once. And all of a sudden, I mean, I'm revving it up, and I don't know what to do next. And I began to let the clutch, apparently. I didn't know what the hell the clutch was at that point. I'm ready to, and fortunately, a Russian rider grabbed my right hand and, got the clutch back in. So it didn't, otherwise I would have been launched up there with Yuri Gagarin into space at that point. So we decided this would not be such a good idea after all. So now they got to get me out of the leathers, blah, blah, blah. Now we're going to go do a conventional scene set, but we're late.
Oh, God.
So race is supposed to start at 7:30, 8 o'clock, whatever it was. I'm standing out there. The Germans are there in the stands. They're packed. They're chanting. They're singing. And all of a sudden, I start to do the scene set on tape. And now we have to stop. We have a technical issue. And next thing I hear is whistling, which, of course, is booing. And then I've got bottles whizzing by my head from the stands. So I have the interpreter there. And I said, what the hell? What happened? He said, well, your producer had the PA announcer say that it'd just be a few more minutes. American television needs about 10 more minutes before we can start. I said, what? I said, you almost got me killed. I got vodka bottles ready to slice my head open, and that was motorcycles.
The thrill of victory, the agony of defeat.
The thrill of victory. I could have been the guy that fell off the ski jump, and it would have been better than that video.
Oh my God. Oh man. No, I know Jeff Mason. He was one of the integral founding producers and advisors of NFL Network. He's just he's one of one too, man. There's no doubt about that. So okay, in the time we have left here, how did you get to Monday night? How did that chair appear? And then obviously the rest is history.
I talked about Jack Quinn early on, who hired me to do the Hawaii Islanders, and Jack Quinn, I always thought of him as my trampoline. He gave me the break. He gave me the break to get into the business. And, everybody said, it would have happened anyway. I don't know if it would have happened, Rich. You got to get that initial break. So I go back to Quinn, and then I go forward to 1986 to Dennis Swanson. Dennis Swanson came over and took over for Roone Arledge and ran ABC Sports. Arledge had been running sports and news, but Arledge had spent 95% of his time in news, and sports is kind of over here running by itself. Gifford was doing the games with O.J. Simpson and Joe Namath in those years, Monday Night Football. Keith was on college football. I'm doing the number 2 game. I'm doing Monday Night Baseball. So I've got a full plate. Dennis Swanson, a man I'd never met, takes over in January of 86. And 2 days later, it's announced that I am going to be the new play-by-play man on Monday Night Football. What? That came out of nowhere. And that came out of for me. And then Dennis was a very big college football fan. And he had seen my work over a number of years. And he said, you make the games very exciting for me. So I'm going, you never know who's listening. So he was watching a number of college games through the years. And he said, I want you in the booth. I want you doing the play-by-play on Monday Night Football. And I'm going to move Frank to analyst, and it'll be a 2-man booth. Fine. Wow. After I'm thinking, well, this isn't. Actually, I was very nervous, thinking, damn, I really haven't followed the NFL that closely. Now I'm going to do Monday Night Football. And Frank was resistant to make the change at first, but then agreed to it. And we wound up doing the 86 season together. And then we added Dan Deerdorf in 1987 to make it a 3-man booth. And we danced that dance as the trio through 1997. So I had 12 seasons with Frank, and Dan lasted through 98, and 12 with Dan as well. Those were good times. Those were great times. We were, I don't want to say we were trying to save Monday Night Football, but the show had begun to leak a little bit, and I think it sort of came back in the late 80s and through the 90s. And then we've had, different iterations of it until it went over to ESPN in 2006. But that's how it happened. It happened with Swanson putting me in that role. I was not reluctant to take it, but I was nervous as a cat. And in fact, in the first game that I did, regular season, was the Giants at Dallas. And you've got Bill Parcells on one sideline, Tom Landry on the other sideline. It's Monday Night Football. And I was so nervous, I welcomed people to the 1976 football season. And then I caught myself, and I looked at Frank, and I said, well, it's already been a long year. So anyway, and that's how it got underway. And, here it is, 20 years on Monday night and going on 16 now on Sunday night.
Is it the same? Was it the same thing as it currently is now, that you get times before the games with the coaches and interview them? And if so, does that mean you had one of your first broadcaster coaches meetings with Landry and Parcells? Is that the way it went?
That was the case, yeah. Landry, and then he had Paul Hackett in that meeting as well. Hackett, I think, was the offensive coordinator of the Cowboys, and then Parcells came into the meeting, and it was funny because Joe Morris, who was their number 1 back, was holding out, and he was holding out at that point. And so I'm new to the game. At least I didn't know Bill at that point. So I said, how big of a deal is it if Joe doesn't play? He goes, not a deal at all. Like that. It's like, okay, Bill would always not denigrate you in any malicious way, but it was always like, no matter what question you'd ask, Bill had to be the contrarian in terms of an answer. Anyway, I wound up loving Parcells, covering him for a ton of years. He almost became the analyst on Monday Night Football in 2000, had an opportunity to do it. Yes, he did. Yes, and passed on it. Yeah, I know I'm jumping around here, but so Frank leaves after 97. Deerdorf's gone after 98. I worked 2 seasons with Boomer Esiason, 98 with Deerdorf, and 99 just the 2 of us. In 2000, Don Ohlmeyer comes in to produce the show, and he wants to He wants to do something really different. And the really different thing that he did, of course, is we hired Dennis Miller. But that's a different story. Before we hired Dennis, though, that role was going to go to Parcells because Bill was now leaving football. He coached the Jets. Now you got the whole thing going on where Bill's going to move into the front office, maybe. This is the whole Belichick year. This is not going to be the HC of the NYJ year, right? So you got Belichick getting the Jets job and then walking away from it to go to New England. Parcells going, does he really want to do front office work, or does he want to go to ABC? And Bill and I had two very, very long discussions on the phone. And the thing about Parcells was he always had all of the answers, right? You're asking the questions, but we spent two very long conversations on the phone. He must have asked 50 questions, wanted to know how everything would work. It was great. And he's such an intelligent man. His knowledge of football, of course, is superb. And at the end of the day, he said, at the end of our second conversation, he said, I don't know if I'm going to take this job or not. I tried to tell him, hey, take the job. Come on out here. We'll play golf and do the whole thing. I want him to take the job. And then he said, I don't know if I'll take the job. He said, if I do, I'll be the best analyst ever. And I said, Bill, that's all I want to hear, because I don't want this to be a halfway house for you. Guys, get out of coaching and come back into coaching, right? We've seen a whole bunch of them. So if you haven't gotten your coaching jollies, if they're not out of your body, this means too much to the rest of us. And that's when he said what he said about he'd be the best ever. And of course, there was a part of me that knew that he had to go back to coaching at some point. And of course, that happened in 2003 when he began to coach the Cowboys for 4 seasons.
He would have been terrific. I agree, because that's the one thing. Obviously Madden is one of the all-time greats at it, because he talked in a language that people completely understood, and from folksy to plain to just describing the. Obviously, Collinsworth has that gene in him as well. The way that you could just describe something and it doesn't sound like you're filled with jargon. It's just normal, plain English that makes sense, And I think Bill would have been great at that.
Oh yeah, and with Madden too, and Collinsworth, they make it fun too. They make it not only interesting, but there's a lightness to it too as well. There's none of the three technique and the wide not. We get into that too, but you got to come away from that stuff and see the bigger, broader picture. And I've been fortunate with John and Chris over the last almost 20 years now. It doesn't get any better than that. And you know what it is though, Rich? It's communication. Those guys know how to communicate. They know how to connect with the audience. And that's why, John he understood what it was. He understood what it means to listen to somebody. I mean, to me, I've always thought, when I enjoy myself, in other words, if I'm a listener, I want to make sure that what I'm saying is interesting, informative, and on point with me as a viewer. So you try to put yourself in the viewer's position. What does he need to know? What does he have to know? What's fun to know? What's different? And you try to kind of flip the mirror a little bit to think of yourself as a listener as well as a communicator.
Right, and then talk about things that, and again, normally or plainly, I guess would be the way to put it. And, Madden, you had a seat next to him, hearing the way that he would communicate. The thing that will always live with me isn't from his game, but from his Pro Football Hall of Fame speech about the busts talking to each other. It just was such a fan thing to say, like, do they talk, and what do they talk about when the lights go out? And then one of the last lines he said is like, and I'm going to be having one of those busts in there talking, forever and ever, talking about whatever. And that was like almost poetry, and it, you know what I mean? Like that's so, and I miss him.
Oh my God. He's one of the smartest people ever. I mean, you look at John, he's kind of larger than life, and he's got all the sound effects and the boom and the whole thing. but people don't understand. This is a man who knows a lot about a lot. And in my 7 years with John, I mean, we had some great, great times. And most of them dealt with like dinners or discussions that we had about things other than football. I mean, we spent enough time on football. We got it. We knew it. And we're doing a game, every week. But John could discuss anything. He was a very curious man. Very. And of course, going around the country, that's what he always wanted to do. He loved, stopping in the coffee shop in Goodland, Kansas, and getting to know the people. And that's I think part of the reason that John was able to connect as a communicator with like every demographic in every part of the country.
Well, Al, I'm going to finish up with you the way I'm planning to finish up with all the other interviews for this 10-part series of just getting started on NFL voices and broadcasters. And it's the best piece of advice you received in your career. What was it, and from whom?
Well, I would say it's kind of it's a little odd in a way, but I'll never forget. I loved Kurt Gowdy as a broadcaster. Loved him, and I got to do the 1972 World Series with him when I was doing the Cincinnati Reds, and we won the pennant. And I actually had met Kurt when I was in college, and he was doing the Red Sox, and I played a tape for him at spring training. So he knew about me. Now we're doing the World Series together, and I'll never forget one of the things he said, and he was toward the end of his career, and I'm starting mine basically, and he said to me, "Never get jaded." Thought, really? I'm having too much fun. But as you got older and you would, proceed on in the business, if things necessarily didn't work out for you, if, you didn't get whatever opportunity that you thought somebody else got that you should have gotten, or you get tired of, you just grow weary of whatever travel or maybe the sameness if you're doing baseball, 162 games a year. So it was a very odd thing to hear when I was 27. But as I moved along through the years, I thought to myself, you know what? That's right. This is one of the greatest jobs ever created, ever. And I keep going back to, being the 6, 7-year-old walking in Ebbets Field. And here I am on the other end of the life spectrum. And I still get excited about it. Walking into a stadium fills up the noise, the whole thing, the drama of the games themselves. It's never gone away. But I keep thinking about what Kurt said. Don't get jaded. And I never will.
You're the man, Al Michaels. Love you. I love you. Best to Linda, because she's been part of everything that we just talked about for all those years as well. This just scratched the surface, which is amazing. I literally could talk to you forever, but I appreciate the time. You're the best.
Richie, anytime. Take care, man. See you soon.
You got it. That's Al Michaels here on Just Getting Started. The one and only Al Michaels. They truly broke the mold with Al, and he is at the top of his game, as great as he's ever been. And what makes Al so great is so few people can meet a moment like Al. And we all know him meeting the moment for, say, the Olympics, say when Malcolm Butler stepped in and intercepted a pass in the Super Bowl to win a game for one team that looked like it was about to lose and beat a team that looked like it was about to win. It's the least expected moment you could ever imagine from a guy that had to be so deep down on Al's list of players that he had to study and know by name and uniform number, and Malcolm Butler. And that's meeting a moment. And then there's also living in a moment. Obviously, again, his miracle play. The famed 2011 call on Monday Night Football of Antonio Freeman juggling a ball that looked like it had hit the ground, but he really had caught it. He did what? I mean, sometimes a perfect call is somebody living in the moment and saying what's in our own heads without obviously the curse words. Like, he did what? I mean, it's a perfect call of a moment like Antonio Freeman. And then, of course, living in the moment like Favre doing what he did the night that he played after his father had passed away. I mean, I could truly go on and on. Those are two special aspects of a sports broadcaster that Al personifies together, but it's also knowing the nuts and bolts, not just down and distance. I mean, when NBC added Terry McCauley, an official, a rules expert, to their Sunday night broadcast, because my buddy Mike from back in the day at NFL Network, Mike Pereira, was doing such a great job on Fox as a rules analyst, everybody started adding one to their national broadcast. And they added Terry McCauley to the NBC Sunday Night Football broadcast. And my first thought was, why? Because Al is the rules expert. Al is the guy who knows what is in the rule book and whether it applies to something that's under review or something that should be reviewed or why a clock is stopped. He is truly unbelievable like that. And in terms of meeting the moment, you just heard what his, and living in the moment and knowing the moment altogether, that makes him, arguably the greatest who's ever done it. But the living in the moment is so tough to do, to know what you're seeing in real time and know what it means and know how to put it in perspective and also know how to react to it emotionally, that you at home can plug into. Hearing his advice that he got from back in his day from Kurt Gowdy, don't get jaded. And you could just hear it in the hitch in Al's voice when it's time for a season kickoff, like we're hearing this week, or a big moment that he's going to call in week 4 on Sunday Night Football, which is the greatest piece of filet mignon steak that the 2021 NFL schedule is going to serve up, which is Tom Brady returning to New England with the Buccaneers, taking on, at the time of this podcast dropping, Mac Jones, healthy and ready to roll as a rookie starter, wearing Tom Brady's college number 10 as TB12 returns. That that somebody's called so much and been there and done that, calling an Olympics moment that is the number one moment of the 20th sports century, calling many Super Bowls like the one that I just mentioned with Malcolm Butler, calling a World Series during an earthquake, doing everything from minor league baseball, as you heard in Hawaii, and also doing wide world of sports and nearly dying in the process because he nearly wiped out on an ice motorcycle, or had a bunch of East Germans getting very angry that he was holding up the start of that event. That after having been there and done all that, that the broadcast that means the most to him, that gives him the goosebumps, is his latest one and then his next one. So the greats get the advice and the greats absorb the advice, and then the greats live the advice. And Al is just the best, and I'm honored to know him. He spoke at my 50th birthday party. He's, he and his wife and mine, me and my wife go out to dinner, and I just hear all these stories. Half the stories that you heard here tonight on this podcast are stories that I've heard before, and even though I have them on my daily show, which you can also hear on the Cumulus Podcast Network, the Rich Eisen Show, all 3 hours every day, sometimes I don't have the forum for him to tell these stories. And that Tommy LaSorda story, I knew it. It's one of my favorites, of Tommy LaSorda talking about that the Dodgers, even though they already have Vince Scully, should hire this kid, and telling that to Al Campanis. And the reason why he knew Al was so good at the broadcast is because Tommy's been ejected so much that he's actually had to listen to Al's play-by-play. I just love these stories, and I can't wait to bring more of them to you throughout this entire series of special Just Getting Starteds, where Jim Nantz and next week Joe Buck will come along and tell you their stories, and Kevin Harlan of Westwood One, and Michael Strahan and Aaron Andrews of Fox, and we're adding more guests as we speak over this 10-week span. So keep on looking back here every single Wednesday for a latest episode of Just Getting Started. This special podcast series of voices of the NFL rolls on. We appreciate you taking in this one with the great Al Michaels.